I am Lauren Mitchell, 32 years old, and for most of my life, I was the one overlooked, the one expected to quietly make do while my sister shined in the spotlight. So I built my life differently. I worked, I saved, I sacrificed for 7 years until I finally had what I thought no one could touch, a little house of my own. On New Year's Day, I walked into my parents' home, believing it would be just another dinner, laughter around the table, the usual talk about kids and rent and daily struggles. But then, the smiles shifted, the glances tightened, and I realized there was a surprise waiting for me. Not a gift, not a celebration, but a plan already written without me. My home, the one thing I had earned, was suddenly at the center of their expectations. What happened next left me questioning not just where I belonged in my family, but how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. Would you have stayed silent, or would you have drawn the line? Stay with me, because this story will shake the way you think about family and loyalty. Let me take you back to where it began. I was 32 years old when I finally felt the weight of my past begin to make sense. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and for as long as I can remember, I have lived with numbers, plans, and discipline tucked under my skin like a second heartbeat. While most people looked at a paycheck as a ticket to comfort, I saw it as a blueprint for survival. My spreadsheets were not cages, they were freedom. 7 years of balancing, saving, and resisting. Every temptation meant I had something that was mine, not borrowed, not granted, not handed down like leftover scraps. Growing up, my family was small but far from equal. My sister Vicki was 4 years older and carried the light of the household like it had been carved just for her. She had golden hair that gleamed in the sun and a voice that could quiet a room. Every celebration seemed to orbit around her. When she graduated high school, my parents rented a hall and decorated it with lights and flowers. When I graduated, I got a quiet dinner at home with a cake from the grocery store and a pat on the shoulder. The memories are small but sharp. I remember being 16, standing in the driveway as Dad pulled a big red Jeep into the yard, a graduation gift for Vicki. I could still hear the squeal in her voice, the way Mom cried tears of joy, neighbors clapping as if she had won the lottery. A few years later, when I turned 18 and needed a car for community college, Dad handed me the keys to his old gray Civic. It smelled like oil and had a crack across the dashboard. He said with a shrug that it still ran fine, no need to be picky. I smiled because that was what was expected of me. But inside, I promised myself that one day I would not be the afterthought. Mom was softer in tone but never subtle in her choices. Vicki was enrolled in dance classes, piano lessons, and later got her tuition covered when she wanted to study out of state. I worked evenings at the grocery store to cover my classes, coming home with sore feet and a smile that hid how tired I was. The favoritism was like wallpaper in our house. You stopped noticing it after a while, but it colored everything. By the time I was 25, I had already learned that waiting for fairness in my family was like waiting for spring in the middle of December. It was never coming, so I poured myself into work. Numbers made sense. Spreadsheets did not change their minds. I became a financial advisor at a firm in downtown Seattle, not because I wanted to chase wealth, but because I wanted to understand it, protect it, make sure no one could ever tell me again that I had to settle for less. The job was demanding, but it was mine. I built my life carefully, quietly. While Vicki married Mark Hayes, a civil engineer, and had 2 kids, I lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. The rent was cheap because the owners trusted me. I did not fill the place with new furniture or expensive art. My joy came from sitting by the window with a cup of tea, reading, or updating my accounts. 7 years slipped by like beads on a string. I ate out only a few times a month, bought clothes when I needed them, and not when I wanted them, hiked the trails in the Cascades, instead of booking flights to resorts. Every dollar had a purpose. By the end of 2023, my 3 accounts told me a story that felt unreal. My housing fund had crossed the threshold for a down payment. My emergency fund was solid enough to carry me for years. My investments had grown like steady roots. For the first time in my life, I was not just surviving. I was ready to choose. It felt almost strange to sit there at my kitchen table in December, scrolling through listings and letting myself imagine more than survival. I saw small wooden houses with porches, gardens where I could plant tomatoes and basil, spaces filled with light instead of the constant hum of traffic. One in Snohomish caught my breath. 2 bedrooms, a little greenhouse, trees swaying behind it. Nothing grand, but it looked like peace. Peace was not something I grew up with. Our family dinners were full of laughter, but it was laughter that belonged to Vicki's stories about her plans for her. When I spoke about my day, there was polite nodding before the conversation swung back to her children, her problems, her needs. I had learned to hold my stories close. That was why, sitting in that quiet apartment, I felt tears burn the corners of my eyes as I opened my ledger and saw the numbers align. 7 years of discipline had finally brought me to this point. I could buy a house of my own. Not a place anyone picked for me. Not a home I was told to share. A place that reflected me, my choices, my patience. I thought about the long winter nights working overtime, the missed trips with friends, the meals of soup and sandwiches when I could have splurged. I thought about the parties I skipped because I was too tired, the moments when loneliness sat heavy in my chest. But I reminded myself that I was building something. None of it was wasted. I remembered the red Jeep again, the way my parents looked at Vicki, like she had hung the stars. That image never left me. But sitting there with my accounts open and my future in front of me, I realized it had pushed me instead of breaking me. I did not need a Jeep to prove my worth. I needed my own set of keys, a door that opened only for me, a roof that sheltered me because I earned it. I closed my laptop and let the silence of the room wrap around me. It was not loneliness anymore. It was space I had carved out with years of effort. I did not know then that this space would soon be threatened, that the very people who had taught me to live without expectation would try to claim what I had built. But in that moment, I only knew one thing. For the first time in my life, I was ready to step into a future I had written with my own hands. And with that thought, I promised myself that nothing and no one would take it away. On the last Sunday of December, I sat at my kitchen table with papers spread around me like puzzle pieces. The morning light came in pale through the window, touching the rim of my coffee cup, and I felt a nervous energy humming through my hands. I opened my laptop and logged into my accounts, the same routine I had done for years, but this time the numbers felt different. They looked complete, like the end of a long journey. I checked the balance in my housing fund, then my emergency fund, then my investments. I wrote them down on a notepad, adding columns and subtracting costs, running the math the way I always did. No matter how many times I rechecked, the answer was the same. I was ready. I picked up the phone and called the broker I had been speaking to in secret. His name was Daniel, a man in his late 40s with a calm voice that never rushed. He answered quickly, and I could almost hear him smiling through the line when I said I wanted to move forward. He told me about the paperwork, the inspection, the down payment. I listened, pens scratching against paper, and felt my heart race faster than it ever had in a boardroom. This was not just another transaction. This was the moment my years of restraint turned into something solid. That afternoon, I drove north towards Snohomish to see the little house again. The sky was heavy with winter clouds, and the roads were slick with leftover rain, but my hands gripped the steering wheel with a strange calm. When I pulled up, the sight of the small wooden frame with its green trim made me pause. The house stood tucked among bare trees, a modest porch stretching across the front. There was a greenhouse at the back, its glass walls catching the gray light, and raised garden beds lined neatly along the yard. I could already picture herbs growing, tomatoes twisting up thin poles, maybe even lavender along the path. The owner, a kind older man named Frank, greeted me at the door. He was moving to Arizona to live near his daughter. We walked through the rooms together, my eyes brushing over every detail. 2 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of pine from the wood beams. Nothing was excessive, but everything felt right. When he handed me the folder of details, I knew I would not walk away. That night, I sat on my couch flipping through the contract, my chest tight with anticipation. I signed my name, slowly pressing the pen firmly into the paper. My signature looked bolder than usual, as if it carried the weight of all my years of sacrifice. I emailed the documents back then, leaned my head against the wall, listening to the silence. It was done. The house was mine. The next morning, I went to work downtown for a meeting with my manager, Karen Lopez. She was a sharp woman in her mid-40s who had built her career through grit and patience. She closed the door behind me, her dark eyes lighting up. She told me that the firm had been impressed with the proposal I pitched in November and that I would be receiving a raise in January. She also asked if I would take on training some of the new hires. The recognition made me smile, though a part of me knew I would keep this news close. In my family, success did not bring pride. It brought expectation. On the way back home, I stopped by a small bookstore and bought a leather-bound journal. I had not kept a diary since I was a teenager, but something in me wanted to record this new beginning. That night, I wrote about the house the way it felt like mine, and about the raise I had not told anyone. My handwriting was uneven, but the words poured out, and I closed the book with a sense of quiet relief. The days leading up to New Year's passed in a blur of small tasks. I organized my belongings, boxing up what I no longer needed, and scheduled the moving company for later in January. I ordered a set of ceramic mugs for the new kitchen and a soft rug for the living room. I told myself I would not overspend, that every purchase had to be practical, but I allowed these few things. They were not luxuries. They were beginnings. On December 30th, I received a call from Mom reminding me about the New Year's Day dinner. It was tradition, she said, and she expected me to be there. Her tone was warm on the surface, but there was always a thread of command beneath. I promised I would come feeling a mix of dread and duty. For years I had sat at that table listening to stories that revolved around Vicki. I wondered what it would be like to share my own news for once. Later that evening, I spoke to my best friend from college, Jenny, who lived in Portland now. She had always known my struggles with family and favoritism. When I told her about the house, she screamed with joy through the phone. I laughed until tears filled my eyes. She reminded me to celebrate myself, to savor what I had done. Her words settled deep inside me, a reminder that not everyone saw me as second best. On New Year's Eve, I packed a small bag with gifts for my parents and the kids. A scarf for Mom, a set of tools for Dad, books for Emma and Caleb. I wrapped each one carefully, wanting to show thought, even though I doubted it would be enough to shift the balance. The bag sat by my door and I stared at it for a long while before turning off the light. The night stretched quiet, and still the city hushed under winter fog. I lay awake thinking about the little house in Snohomish, about the porch and the garden and the fireplace. I imagined myself sitting there with tea in hand, no one else's demands pressing against me, no comparisons stealing the air from my lungs. For once I let myself dream without guilt. I did not know what waited for me on New Year's Day, how quickly those dreams would be challenged, but as I drifted toward sleep, I held the vision tight. It was mine, and I would not let it go. The day before New Year's Eve, I drove to my parents' house for our usual Sunday dinner. The air was sharp with cold, and the streets were damp from a morning drizzle. I carried a tote bag of gifts I had wrapped, trying to keep my nerves in check. Walking into their home always felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The smell of garlic bread drifted from the kitchen, and Dad's voice carried from the living room where he watched a football game. Vicki was already there with Mark and the kids. Emma was coloring at the dining table, her hair falling into her eyes as she bent over the page, while Caleb chased a toy truck across the floor. Vicki sat on the couch in a neat sweater dress, sipping a glass of orange juice. She looked up when I entered, her smile quick but her eyes cool. Dinner was served the way it always was. Mom moving back and forth from the kitchen, Dad carving the roast, Vicki talking about the latest issues with her apartment downtown. She complained about the rent going up again, about the laundry machines always breaking, and about how the kids had nowhere to play. Mark nodded silently beside her, his fork moving across his plate without much enthusiasm. I tried to listen politely, but my mind wandered back to the little house waiting for me in Snohomish. I thought about the greenhouse and the raised beds, about the soft rug I had ordered that was probably sitting in a warehouse ready to be delivered. I must have smiled without realizing it because Vicki stopped mid-sentence and narrowed her eyes at me. "What are you smiling about, Lauren?" Her voice was light, but carried an edge, the kind of edge only sisters could slip into a question. I hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding anymore. "I said I bought a house." The room went quiet. Forks stilled over plates, and even Caleb stopped pushing his truck for a moment. Mom's eyes widened as if I had spoken in another language. Dad set down his knife slowly, his brows lifting. "You bought a house already," Vicki repeated, her tone sharper now. "Yes," I said, my voice steady though my chest pounded. "I signed the contract this week. It is a small place in Snohomish, quiet, with a bit of land." For a moment no one spoke. Then Dad cleared his throat and said that was a big step. Mom pressed her lips together and gave a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. Vicki blinked at me, then leaned back on the couch, her glass clinking as she set it on the coffee table. "Well," she said, "that is unexpected." I felt heat crawl up my neck, the same heat I used to feel as a teenager when I brought home good grades, only to hear that Vicki had won something bigger. I looked at Emma, who had gone back to coloring, and Caleb, who was now driving his truck under the table, unaware of the tension swirling above him. Dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Vicki asked small questions about the size of the house, about the location, about how much land it had. I answered carefully, keeping my tone neutral. I could sense she was fishing for details, measuring them against her own cramped apartment. After dessert, I helped Mom clear the table. She was quiet, her eyes on the plates, her mouth tight. I waited for her to say something, but she only asked me to hand her the dish soap. I drove home that night with a weight in my chest I could not name. It was supposed to be a moment of pride, but it had turned into something else, something darker. When I got back to my apartment, I set the empty tote bag on the floor and sat in the dark for a while. The silence was heavy, and I felt the beginnings of unease stir in me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining their reactions, but deep down I knew better. The next morning my phone buzzed with a text from Vicki. She wrote congratulations, then quickly followed with questions. Was it 2 bedrooms or 3? Was there a big living room? Was there a fenced yard? I answered briefly, not wanting to give too much away. A few minutes later she sent another message. Must be nice to finally have room, especially for family visits. I stared at the words for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I put the phone down without replying. That afternoon Mom called, her voice overly cheerful. She asked about the house, where it was, exactly how big the backyard was. She said a place like that was perfect for children. She added that Emma and Caleb would love running around in the open air. I forced a laugh, saying I had not even moved in yet, but she kept pressing, her tone light but insistent. When the call ended, I sat on the couch staring at the ceiling. The unease had grown sharper, turning into a suspicion I could not shake. Something in their reactions did not add up. This was not just about me buying a house. It felt like a door had opened for them too, one they thought they had the right to walk through. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered like a shadow at the edge of my mind. That night, as I packed another box of books, I caught myself glancing at my phone, half expecting another message from Vicki, half dreading it. The house was supposed to be my freedom, but already it felt like a battle line was being drawn. 2 nights after that dinner, I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with a new message from Mom. I wiped my hands and picked it up, expecting a simple reminder about New Year's Day plans. Instead, I saw a long link to a real estate site, followed by her words, saying, "This one looks perfect." I tapped the link, and a picture of a large 4-bedroom house filled the screen. It had a wide driveway, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and a backyard with a swing set already standing. The description highlighted the school district, the proximity to grocery stores, and the size of the master suite. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. This was nothing like the small wooden place I had just signed for. This was a house meant for a family of 4 or 5. I typed back quickly saying, "Thanks, but I already bought my house." She replied almost instantly, asking if mine had enough space for guests. I put the phone down without answering. Minutes later, Vicki started sending me messages. She asked if my place had a basement, if the backyard was fenced, if there was a spare room that could be used for the kids. I answered short, saying it was just 2 bedrooms and enough for me. She wrote back one word. Why? I did not respond. The following day, Dad called during my lunch break. I stepped outside the office building to take in the winter air biting my cheeks. His voice was calm, almost casual, as he asked how serious I was about keeping the house small. He said a bigger home would be more practical, that one day I would want people to stay, that families should have space together. I listened in silence, my jaw tightening. When he finished, I told him I was happy with my choice. There was a pause. Then he sighed and said, "All right," but his tone carried disappointment like a weight. That evening, I sat on my couch staring at the boxes stacked against the wall. My chest felt heavy. It was clear now that their questions were not curiosity. They were steering me toward something I had not agreed to. On December 30th, another call came from Mom, this time with more excitement. She had heard through a friend at church about a property on Maple Street where the owners were moving quickly. She said the house had 3 bathrooms, a balcony, and plenty of rooms for children. Her words spilled over each other, painting the picture of a perfect family home. I let her finish before saying calmly that I did not have children, and I had no intention of moving anyone else in. She hesitated, then said, "All day you will want to, and even if not, Vicki and the kids could stay on weekends." The silence that followed felt louder than her words. I hung up, feeling my hands tremble. That night I made tea and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the phone. The pieces were starting to fit together. The glances at dinner, the way Vicki had drilled me with questions, the sudden flood of listings that had nothing to do with my needs. This was not about me finding a home. This was about them finding one through me. I lay awake long after midnight, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside my apartment window. The thought repeated itself like a drumbeat. They did not want me to buy a house. They wanted me to buy one for them. On the morning of New Year's Eve, I decided to clear my head. I drove out to Snohomish to see my little house again, even though the paperwork was already done. The air smelled of wet earth, and the trees were dark silhouettes against the cloudy sky. Standing on the porch, I felt a calm settle over me. This was what I had worked for. This was mine. I walked around the backyard, running my fingers over the wooden railing of the greenhouse. I imagined planting in spring, watching the herbs push through the soil, sitting in the shade with a book, while the sun warmed the boards beneath my feet. The vision steadied me, but as I drove back, my phone buzzed with another message from Vicki. She wrote that Emma and Caleb would be thrilled to have their own rooms, that the schools in Snohomish were so much better, and that I should think about what family really meant. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the road blurring for a moment. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the dread in me had hardened into certainty. The surprise they were building for New Year's Day was no surprise at all. It was a plan, one they had all quietly agreed upon, and I was the last to see it. New Year's Day arrived with a crisp sky and a quiet chill that made the air feel sharp in my lungs. I drove out to my parents' house with the tote bag of gifts on the passenger seat, rehearsing small talk in my head the way I always did before family gatherings. The neighborhood looked still, houses lined with fading holiday lights, a few pine wreaths drooping on doors. Inside the house, I could already hear voices and laughter spilling out before I even turned the knob. The living room was crowded, as it always was on the first day of the year. Dad sat in his chair, football muted on the television, while Mom bustled between the kitchen and the dining table. Vicki was on the couch, Emma curled against her side reading a children's book, and Caleb was kneeling on the floor, pushing toy cars into each other. Mark sat at the edge of the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Happy New Year," Lauren, Mom said, hugging me quickly before moving back to the stove. Her arm smelled faintly of garlic and soap. I handed over the bag of gifts and she set it aside without looking inside. Dinner began early, the table crowded with roast beef, mashed potatoes, and the garlic bread Mom never skipped. We clinked glasses of sparkling cider, and Dad said a short toast about family and health. The chatter was light at first. Vicki bragged about Emma's reading level, Mark added a dry comment about his long hours at work, and Mom nodded along. I smiled when appropriate, but my heart beat harder with every passing minute. I knew something was coming. After plates were half empty, Dad cleared his throat, his fork tapping lightly against his glass. Everyone quieted, and he glanced at Mom before speaking. "We have a little surprise for you all," he said, his tone carrying a kind of forced cheer. Mom folded her hands, her eyes flicking to me then to Vicki. Vicki smiled a little too wide, and Emma looked up, sensing the shift. Caleb continued to bang his car against the table leg, oblivious. Dad continued. "Since Lauren has bought a house, we thought it would be the perfect opportunity for this family to finally have space together." I froze, my fork hovering above my plate. My stomach clenched as he went on. "Starting soon, Vicki and Mark and the kids will be moving in with her." For a second I thought I had misheard. My ears rang. I glanced at Mom, who nodded as if confirming it. Vicki smoothed her dress, not meeting my eyes, and Mark set down his phone slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment. I let out a laugh that sounded brittle even to my own ears. "You are kidding, right?" Nobody laughed. Mom reached across the table and touched my arm, her smile tight. "Honey, it makes perfect sense. You have that whole place to yourself, and Vicki has been struggling with rent and space. The kids deserve better." My chest burned. I pulled my arm back and looked at Vicki. "Did you know about this?" She met my eyes finally, her expression flat. "Of course. We talked about it after Christmas." "So you all made a plan," I said, my voice rising. "And you never thought to ask me first." Dad's face darkened. "We are asking now." "No," I said sharply. "You are telling." The room stilled, forks clinking faintly against plates as the kids looked around confused. Emma whispered something to Caleb, who hugged his toy car tighter. Vicki leaned forward, her voice cool. "You have 2 bedrooms. Emma could have her own room. Caleb could share the other. We would not take over the whole house." "It is my house," I snapped louder than I meant to. My hands shook under the table. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "It would just be until we find something better. I can help fix things up, no charge." I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. "This is insane. I worked for 7 years to buy that home. It is not some halfway stop for whoever needs it." Mom's eyes narrowed. "Lauren, you cannot be so selfish. Family helps family." I felt the old wound of those words. Selfish. The label I had worn since childhood every time I wanted something that was only mine. My throat tightened, but anger steadied me. I stood, my palms pressed flat against the table, looking at each of them. "You did not even give me the decency of asking. You made plans, you spoke to each other, you chose schools for the kids, all without me." Vicki's lips trembled, but she pressed them into a hard line. "You are lucky enough to have stability. I am drowning, and you cannot even open the door." The kids sat silent now, sensing the shift. Emma blinked quickly, and Caleb climbed onto her lap. Dad slammed his hand against the table, his voice booming. "That is enough. This is not about taking from you. It is about doing what is right." I stared at him, my voice quiet but shaking. Doing what is right for who? The room felt suffocating, the smell of garlic bread suddenly too strong. I grabbed my coat from the chair and slid it over my shoulders, my hands clumsy. I could not look at the kids, not with their wide eyes. As I reached for the door, Mom's voice cut through the silence, sharp and final. "If you walk out now, you are turning your back on this family." I paused with my hand on the knob, my heart pounding in my ears, but I did not answer. I stepped outside into the cold January air, letting it sting my skin and clear the fog in my chest. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling their voices, but the echo of what had been said clung to me like smoke. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I hurried down the driveway, my breath clouding in the icy night. I had left the warmth of the house behind, but the cold air felt cleaner than anything I had breathed in that dining room. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, sliding into the driver's seat of my car. I sat there with the engine running, staring through the windshield, trying to understand what had just happened. For a long time, I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, some half-baked suggestion my parents had tossed out too early. But the looks on their faces told me otherwise. They had been planning this not for days, but for weeks, maybe months. It was not just an idea. It was a decision they believed was already made. The next morning, my phone began to buzz before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. Mom's voice came through too bright, as if she was determined to smooth over the cracks from the night before. She said I had overreacted, that they were only trying to make things easier for everyone. She reminded me that Vicki's children deserved space, and that Mark had already offered to help with repairs and upgrades. I listened silent, my jaw clenched. When she paused, I said quietly that no one had asked me. She sighed heavily, then told me I should think about what family really means. When the call ended, I sat with the mug in my hand, watching the steam curl upward. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. They spoke as if my sacrifice was a given, as if my work and my years of restraint belonged to all of them. By afternoon, Vicki sent me a string of messages. She wrote that Emma needed her own room, that Caleb deserved more than a couch corner, that moving in with me was the most logical solution. She ended with a line that felt like a blade. "You are lucky enough to live alone. We are not." That night, Dad called, his voice deeper and heavier than Mom's. He said he had already looked into the schools near Snohomish, that Emma could start fresh there, and Caleb could enroll in the preschool program down the street. He said it like it was already settled. My stomach dropped as he listed the details. He had done the research, spoken to people, maybe even toured the school. So it was not just talk. It was an agreement, an arrangement made without me. I asked him if he understood what he was saying. Did he realize he was planning out my house as if it were his own? He answered that he was planning out a better future for his grandchildren. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Then whose name is on the deed, Dad?" He went quiet for a moment before muttering that blood should matter more than paper. After that, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing every word again and again. They had already built a life inside my walls before I had even carried a single box across the threshold. The following day, I stopped by the office to meet Karen. She congratulated me again on the raise and asked if I had started house hunting. I almost laughed. House hunting. If only she knew what that phrase meant now. I nodded, saying yes, I had found a place, but inside I was a storm. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but shame held me back. What kind of grown woman was cornered by her own family into giving up the very thing she had worked for? That evening I drove back to the house in Snohomish. The sun was setting, casting pale orange light across the porch. I stood there for a long while, my hands stuffed into my coat pockets, trying to picture it filled with people who were not me. The thought made my chest ache. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place carved out of years of silence and saving. When I finally went inside, I ran my hand along the wooden banister, touched the cool glass of the greenhouse, and whispered to myself, "This is mine." The sound of my own voice startled me. It sounded desperate, like a plea I was afraid no one else would honor. On the drive back, my phone rang again. This time it was Mark. His tone was polite, almost apologetic. He said he understood my hesitation, but that I should know he was willing to do the heavy work. He could repaint, remodel, even build out the basement if I wanted. He said it like an offer, but underneath it was expectation. I told him I never asked for help. He paused, then said quietly that he and Vicki were counting on me, that it was the only way forward for them. I felt my throat tighten. I ended the call without another word. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of boxes I had packed. My hands rested flat on the cardboard, and I let the silence stretch. My family saw me as a resource, a backup plan, a safety net they could fall into whenever life pressed too hard. Not one of them had looked at me and asked if I was happy, if this was what I wanted. The truth hit me then, clear and cold. I had thought this was about a house, about rooms and yards and space. But it was not. It was about control. It was about being used. And if I let them, they would never stop. The next weekend, I walked back into my parents' house knowing there was no avoiding the storm. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, and the sound of Emma's laughter came from the hallway as she chased Caleb with a stuffed animal. Everything looked normal, but under the surface I felt the tension coiled tight. We sat around the table as Mom brought out dishes, her voice sweet but sharp when she reminded me to sit closer, so there would be room for the kids. Dad carved the chicken with steady hands, but his eyes never left me. Vicki sat across, her arms folded, while Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I waited until plates were served before I spoke. I am not doing this. The words cut across the clatter of forks and knives. Mom set the serving spoon down too hard, the sound ringing against the dish. Doing what she asked, though her tone told me she knew exactly what I meant. I leaned forward, my voice low but clear. I am not turning my house into yours. I am not raising your children. I am not giving up my life so you can fix your mistakes in mine. The room went still. Vicki's face flushed red and she slammed her hand against the table. You are unbelievable. You sit there in your perfect little life alone, no responsibilities, while I am drowning. All we asked was to share, and you cannot even do that. I shook my head. No, you did not ask. You planned. You chose schools. You picked bedrooms. You made decisions as if I did not exist. Dad's fork hit his plate with a sharp clang. Enough, he barked. You are the only one in this family who has stability. If you cannot step up when your sister needs you, then what good is all that money you guard so tightly? My hands trembled under the table, but my voice rose. What good is it? 7 years of saving, of saying no, of working myself to exhaustion so I could have something of my own. And now you tell me it belongs to all of you. Mom's eyes hardened, her lips thin. We raised you better than this, Lauren. Family comes first. I laughed, a sound that tasted bitter. Family came first when Vicki needed a Jeep, when she wanted to go to school out of state, when she had her wedding paid for. Family never came first when I worked nights to pay tuition, when I drove a car that barely ran, when I lived in a tiny apartment saving every dime. Mark finally spoke, his voice quiet. We are not trying to take from you. We just thought it would work. I turned to him, my words sharp. You thought wrong. Emma looked up from her plate, her small voice breaking the silence. Why is everyone yelling? For a moment no one moved. The children's wide eyes cut deeper than any accusation. Vicki pulled them close, shooting me a look of pure anger. This is what you wanted, isn't it, to make me look like the bad one in front of them? I stood, pushing my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. I did not want this, Vicki. I wanted a home. Just one thing that was mine, but you and Mom and Dad decided it belonged to you the moment I signed the papers. Dad rose from his chair, his voice dropping low. If you walk away from this, you are walking away from all of us. My throat tightened, my chest pounding. I looked around the table at the disappointment etched into my parents' faces, at the fury in Vicki's eyes, at the quiet shame in Mark's. Then I looked at Emma and Caleb, who clung to each other, confused and afraid. I said softly, more to myself than to them, I am not the one tearing this family apart. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on. No one moved to stop me. The only sound was the scrape of my zipper and the faint hum of the refrigerator. As I reached the door, Mom's voice cut through the silence. You are betraying us, Lauren. I paused, my hand on the knob, my back to them. I felt the weight of their stares pressing against me, but I did not turn around. The night air met me again, cold and raw, but it felt like the only honest thing left. I stepped out into it, closing the door behind me with a steady hand, leaving their voices swallowed by the walls I no longer belonged to. The morning after that dinner, I woke with a knot in my stomach that would not ease no matter how many cups of coffee I drank. I called a local attorney, a woman named Sharon I had found through a recommendation at work. She invited me to her office in Everett that same afternoon. I drove there with my palms damp against the steering wheel, my heart pounding like I was heading into a courtroom battle instead of a consultation. Her office was small but neat, bookshelves, lined with thick volumes and certificates on the wall. She greeted me kindly, her short gray hair tucked neatly behind her ears, and gestured for me to sit. I laid out the situation in a rush, from the years of saving to the house I had bought, and finally to the shocking announcement at New Year's dinner. My voice shook as I admitted I was afraid they would find a way to force their plan onto me. Sharon listened patiently, then leaned back and folded her hands. She told me firmly that the deed was in my name alone, the mortgage was under my signature, and there was no legal way for anyone else to claim my house unless I allowed it. She explained terms like tenancy, property rights, and guardianship, making sure I understood that, unless I signed documents, no one had authority. Her calm words washed over me like a tide. For the first time in days, I breathed without the weight pressing down. I thanked her, but when I walked back to my car, the relief was quickly replaced with anger. It should not take a lawyer to remind me that what I had earned was mine. Family should have respected that from the beginning. The following week, Mom's church group held their first meeting of the year, and word began to spread. I did not attend, but by Thursday, I received a message from my Aunt Carol. She wrote that Mom was heartbroken, that people at church could not understand why I would turn my back on my sister and her children. The words felt rehearsed, as if passed down directly from my mother's mouth. On Saturday, I saw my Aunt Linda at the grocery store. She walked up to me near the produce aisle, her cart half full, her expression tight. She told me I was being stubborn, that family was meant to share blessings, and that refusing to help Vicki was shameful. Other shoppers glanced our way as her voice rose. I clenched my jaw, told her my choices were mine, and walked away with my basket. By Sunday night, my phone buzzed with a group text that included several relatives. The message was short and cutting. Do not destroy this family over a house. Think of the children. I sat on my couch, staring at the screen, the words blurring. It was not just my parents and sister anymore. It was cousins, aunts, people who had barely spoken to me in years now, suddenly carrying judgment heavy enough to crush me. They spoke as if my worth as a daughter, as a sister, as a person hinged on whether I opened my door. At work, I kept my head down, but even there, the stress leaked through. During a meeting, my colleague Daniel noticed my distracted stare and asked if I was all right. I brushed it off, saying I was tired. Inside, the tension twisted tighter each day. On a cold Wednesday morning, I walked out to my car and found a folded note tucked under the wiper blade. My name was written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside, the message was brief. Family should not be abandoned over money. The words blurred for a moment, my breath clouding in the frosty air. I crushed the paper in my fist, my chest pounding. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching, but it was empty and still. I shoved the note deep into my coat pocket and drove away, the silence in the car pressing in until I thought I might scream. That night, I sat at my table with the crumpled note beside me. I smoothed it out and read it again, then tore it into pieces so small they looked like snowflakes. As they scattered into the trash, I whispered to myself that it was not about money. It was about boundaries, respect, and survival. Still, the weight of their voices clung to me. Every accusation, every reminder of family duty, every whisper from people who had no part in my sacrifices. It was as if I was standing on one side of a river with my house behind me while my entire family stood on the other bank shouting for me to build a bridge. I did not pick up the phone that week when my parents called again. I let the ringing fade into silence, sat in the glow of my small apartment, and tried to remember the feeling of peace I had found standing in the greenhouse of my new home. But it was slipping, crowded out by the chorus of voices telling me I was wrong, selfish, cold. Late one evening, I lit a candle and sat by the window. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain. I thought about how easily they had turned the story against me, how quickly they had painted me as the villain. And I knew with a sinking certainty that this fight was only just beginning. The moving truck pulled up to the little house in Snohomish on a pale Monday morning, its brakes sighing against the quiet street. My heart pounded as I signed the paperwork with the driver and watched two men begin unloading boxes. The air smelled damp and fresh, and the sound of birds came from somewhere beyond the maple trees. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Inside the house was still and cool. My boxes stacked against the walls looked small in the empty rooms, but it gave me space to imagine. I walked slowly from the living room to the kitchen, tracing my hand along the wooden counters, pausing by the window that looked out into the yard. The greenhouse caught the morning light, its glass panes gleaming even in the gray weather. By the second day, I was unpacking books onto the shelves I had carried in myself, arranging my tea mugs in the kitchen, and spreading the rug across the living room floor. Each step felt like placing a stone in the foundation of my own life. No one told me to leave space for guests. No one asked about spare rooms. No one questioned the color of the walls. I painted my office olive green because it reminded me of calm forests, not because anyone else approved. Grace, the neighbor across the street, came by with a basket of lavender muffins as a welcome. She was in her 50s, warm eyes and an easy laugh, and she asked nothing about my family or why I had moved. She only wanted to know if I liked to garden and told me about a small club that met once a month. I promised I would come. Later that week, I met Ethan, a local landscaper around my age, who came to repair the irrigation system in the backyard. He walked me through the setup, explained how the pipes had cracked during the winter, and showed me how to clear the filters myself. His hands were rough from work, his voice steady. We talked about soil and sunlight, about how rabbits could ruin an entire patch of lettuce. For the first time in a long time, I spoke without holding my breath. Work improved too. Without the constant buzzing of family calls, I poured myself into my projects. A major client approved a proposal I had written, and Karen called to congratulate me personally. She said my focus and precision were exactly what the firm needed for the training program. I thanked her, smiling at the thought of recognition that did not come with strings attached. On Saturday, I rode my bike to the farmer's market downtown. The stalls were filled with fresh produce, jars of honey, handmade soaps. I picked out carrots, kale, and a small jar of jam. A little girl dropped her list on the ground, and I handed it back with a smile. Her mother invited me to a book club at the library, and I found myself saying yes before I even thought about it. At night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the trees sway. The silence was not loneliness anymore. It was peace, something I had fought hard to earn. But peace did not mean I was free from the past. One evening, as I returned from the market, I noticed a white envelope lying on the welcome mat. No stamp, no address, just my name in handwriting I did not recognize. My stomach twisted as I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Family should not be abandoned over money." The sentence was sharp and simple, but it pierced me. I stood in the entryway staring at it, my breath shallow. Someone had come all the way here to my new home and left this on my doorstep. I crushed the paper in my fist, then smoothed it out again, reading the words over and over. I whispered into the empty house, "It is not about money, it is about boundaries." I tucked the note into a drawer, but the unease lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I listened to every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, as if expecting someone to knock. Still in the morning, I pulled on my boots and went outside to water the small pots of herbs I had planted. The rosemary smelled sharp, the basil sweet. The greenhouse windows gleamed in the rising sun, and I felt steadier again. The house was mine. The life was mine. Grace waved from across the street, and Ethan later stopped by with spare wood for the garden beds. Their small gestures reminded me that I was not alone, not truly. For the first time in years, I realized I could choose the people who entered my life instead of accepting whoever demanded space. I poured myself another cup of tea that evening, sat by the window, and let the quiet hold me. The phone stayed silent. No group texts, no guilt-laden calls, no endless demands. Just the steady sound of wind through the trees, carrying the promise that this new beginning was real. February rolled in with a gray sky and mornings that smelled of wet pine. I had fallen into a rhythm at the new house, balancing work calls, with afternoons tending to the garden beds, but the quiet never fully erased the tension sitting at the edge of my mind. I had not heard directly from my parents in weeks, though the occasional message from relatives still found its way to my inbox. Most of the time I deleted them without reading. Then one Friday afternoon I got an email from Vicki. The subject line was empty, just my name. My stomach knotted before I even clicked it open. She wrote 3 paragraphs about how Mark had been laid off from his engineering firm, how rent was swallowing them whole, and how the kids were starting to ask why they did not have space like other families. She ended with a single sentence. "How can you watch us suffer and do nothing?" I closed the laptop, my throat tight. For a moment I almost reached for the phone to call her, but then I remembered the dinner table, the accusations, the word selfish ringing in my ears. I sat there in the silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the room, and told myself I could not go back. The following week work picked up, and I threw myself into it. Karen sent me new files to review for a client expansion, and the hours blurred together. I felt sharper than I had in years, unburdened by the constant pull of family demands. For the first time, my colleagues saw me not just as dependable, but as innovative. A small part of me knew this focus was my revenge, quiet and steady. But Vicki did not stop. A second email came, longer than the first this time, accusing me of abandoning Emma and Caleb. She wrote that they had outgrown their bunk bed, that Caleb slept with his toys on the floor, that Emma cried at night because she wanted privacy. The words hit me harder than I expected, images of the children surfacing in my mind. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then shut the computer with a sharp snap. Nights were the hardest. I would sit on the porch with tea, looking out at the maple trees, trying to push her voice from my head. The wind rustled the branches, and I repeated the words Sharon, the lawyer, had told me. "It is your house. It is your decision." But guilt has a way of slipping in, even through locked doors. March came, and with it the first signs of spring. Green shoots pushed up through the soil, and the greenhouse filled with the smell of damp earth. I joined Grace's gardening club one Saturday, and spent the morning talking about compost and seed swaps, letting their warmth soak into me. For a few hours I forgot about the emails. Then, one rainy evening, I came home to find the porch light flickering. I unlocked the door, set my bag down, and was halfway to the kitchen when a knock sounded. It was soft at first, then firmer. My chest tightened. Hardly anyone knocked on my door unannounced. I walked to the entryway, my hand hovering over the knob, and peered through the peephole. Vicki stood there in the drizzle, her hair damp, her eyes dark with exhaustion. Beside her, Emma clutched a worn backpack, and Caleb leaned against her leg, holding a stuffed animal with one ear torn. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I did not move. The house was quiet behind me, warm and safe, while outside stood the sister who had turned my family against me. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but no words came through the glass. Emma looked up, her face pale, and pressed her small hand against her mother's coat. The knock came again, lighter this time. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached for the knob, but stopped, frozen in the weight of the moment. The rain pattered against the porch roof, steady and unrelenting, as I stood on the other side of the door, caught between anger and something I could not yet name. I opened the door slowly, the cool, damp air rushing in, carrying the faint smell of rain-soaked earth. Vicki stood on the porch with her shoulders sagging, her hair plastered to her face. Emma and Caleb huddled close to her, their eyes wide and uncertain. I was not sure what I expected her to say, but when her lips parted, her voice was nothing more than a whisper. I was not sure you would even open the door. I stepped aside, my hand trembling against the frame. The kids slipped past, first their shoes squeaking on the floorboards, and Vicki followed, her tote bag hanging limply from her shoulder. The warmth of the house wrapped around them, and for a long moment none of us spoke. Emma looked at me, her small voice hesitant. Aunt Lauren, Mom said if we were good we could see your garden. Her words softened something in me, even as anger still simmered under my skin. I crouched down to her level and brushed damp hair from her cheek. I just planted white chrysanthemums. Do you want to see them tomorrow when the rain stops? She nodded, clutching her backpack tighter. We sat in the living room, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I made tea and set out a plate of crackers, though none of us seemed hungry. Vicki wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into the steam as if she could find answers there. Finally, she spoke, her voice raw. I thought you would always take it all. That was how Mom raised us, how she taught me. That you would be the one who could carry everything. Her words cut through me. I wanted to lash out, to remind her of all the times I had been overlooked, all the sacrifices she never saw. Instead, I said quietly, "You never asked. You all just assumed." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. I was drowning, Lauren. Rent piling up, Mark out of work, 2 kids sharing one room. And I thought, you have stability, you have more than me, so of course you would share. I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of my chair. It was never about stability. It was about respect. You all made plans for my life like I was not even in the room. Emma and Caleb sat curled on the rug, whispering to each other, unaware of the heaviness above their heads. Vicki followed my gaze to them, her face softening. She whispered, I did not mean to turn them against you. But I did, and I am sorry. The words hung there, fragile and uncertain. I did not forgive her in that moment, not fully. But I also did not push her out into the rain. We sat in silence again. The children nibbling on crackers, the rain slowing outside. My mind replayed every moment of the past weeks, every cutting word, every plan made without me. Yet here she was stripped of pride, holding only exhaustion. Finally I said, You are not weak, Vicki. But you have spent your whole life letting others solve your problems. That is not strength. That is avoidance. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Maybe I needed to hear that. The clock ticked on the mantel, steady and unbothered. I poured her more tea, the steam rising between us like a fragile bridge. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, if this was a momentary crack in her pride or the start of something real. But as Emma curled against my side and Caleb drifted to sleep on the rug, I felt the first shift in a wall I had thought would never move. A few weeks later, the air in Snohomish began to warm the mornings, carrying a faint smell of damp soil and budding leaves. Life settled into a quiet rhythm again. Vicki had taken the kids back to their apartment after that night in my living room, and though she did not call often, she sent short texts now and then. They were not demands anymore, just simple updates, little proofs that she was trying. One afternoon, I sat at my desk finishing a financial plan when an email from Human Resources appeared. I opened it absent-mindedly, expecting the usual updates, but the words froze me. We are reviewing candidates for the training program. One of them listed you as a professional reference. The name on the file read Victoria Hayes. My breath caught as I scrolled further. She had included a quote from my professional blog in her application. Everyone deserves a fresh start, but you have to take the first step on your own. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. She had not asked me to help, had not begged me to write a letter. She had taken her own step. Something inside me softened, though the old ache remained. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mailbox, written in Emma's uneven handwriting. Aunt Lauren I helped Mom write her resume. She is really trying hard. She still does not drink ginger tea right, but I am teaching her. Did you plant more purple flowers? I traced the crooked letters with my finger, my chest tightening. That weekend, I went to the town book fair with Emma and Caleb. They darted between tables picking up children's books while I spotted Ethan leading an art activity for kids under a maple tree. Caleb tugged my hand asking for paints, and Emma settled on a bench with a stack of stories. Ethan looked up and smiled, his eyes warm. These two look like they already belong here. Later that evening, back at my house, I set their new books on the coffee table and watched them flip pages with quiet excitement. For the first time, their presence did not feel like intrusion. It felt like choice, like opening a door because I wanted to, not because I was forced. Work kept me busy, but in the evenings I found peace in the garden. The basil thrived, the rosemary spread strong, and the chrysanthemums Emma loved swayed gently in the breeze. Sometimes Ethan dropped off a basket of oranges with a note that simply said, "Stay warm." Grace invited me to help plan the spring garden swap. For the first time, my life was not measured by what my family demanded, but by what I chose to build. Months passed, and then one morning, I walked into the firm for a training session. Across the lobby, I saw Vicki. She was dressed in a simple blouse, her hair pulled back neatly, and she carried a folder close to her chest. She caught my eye and gave a small nod, not asking for anything, not pushing. Just a nod. I returned it, silent but steady. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the last light fade through the trees, I thought about how far things had shifted. Family had once been a chain pulling me down, a constant reminder of what I owed, and never enough of who I was. Now I understood something different. Family could not be forced. It had to be chosen, like the people you let walk through your door, like the moments you allow to grow roots in your life. I wrapped my sweater tighter, breathing in the cool night air. The house behind me was warm, filled with the smell of tea and books and soil. Every corner carried my fingerprints, my choices, my freedom. Maybe forgiveness would come in time, maybe not. But peace had already found me, and that was enough. What about you? If you were in my place, would you have opened the door for them again, or would you have shut it for good? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this resonate with you, remember to like and subscribe so you can stay with me for the next journey.